SaferWatch and law enforcement. SaferWatch is a powerful tool that enhances public safety by improving communication between law enforcement and the community it serves. Through the SaferWatch platform, agencies can send real-time emergency and non-emergency alerts, keeping residents and visitors informed about critical incidents, safety advisories, and community updates. Additionally, SaferWatch allows the public to report crime tips, suspicious activities, and threats, providing law enforcement with valuable intelligence. SaferWatch tips have led to the prevention of school shootings, stopped sexual predators, caught wanted fugitives and burglary suspects, and has even prevented suicides. This easy-to-use two-way communication tool ensures faster response times and helps protect the community proactively. By empowering both citizens and law enforcement, SaferWatch fosters a safer, more connected community. For more information, visit saferwatchapp.com or download the free SaferWatch app on iOS or Android. Welcome to The Tactical Pause, the official podcast of the Florida Deputy Sheriff's Association. I'm John Creamer, Deputy Executive Director of FDSA. Each episode, I sit down with law enforcement thought leaders to tackle critical issues shaping the future of public safety. Together, we'll explore key topics that empower law enforcement professionals to navigate challenges, lead with confidence, and advance their careers. Take a pause, gain valuable insights, and lead your career with purpose. Thanks for listening. Today's guest is my friend and Sheriff Michael Adkinson, Sheriff of Walton County. Sheriff Adkinson is a lifelong member of Walton County and a Florida native, and he joins us today to discuss emerging technology. In today's episode, we'll talk about how things used to be when the sheriff and I started in law enforcement in the 1990s, how things are now, and how we see the landscape as we move forward. Okay, so the three pillars of today's episode are technology in the early 1990s, the huge growth of technology in the last 20 years, and then the emerging technologies, where are we moving forward? And the thread that we're going to have to run through all that is leadership. So when you started in law enforcement, when was that, Sheriff?
So you know what? I was thinking about this before we got on air. And, I got issued a 686 Smith & Wesson.
The old revolver.
Wheel gun. Yeah, a wheel gun. And maybe that's the thing that a lot of people see right off the front is those old, that sounds like some 1980s lethal weapon. What did Danny Glover have? The old wheel gun.
Yeah.
They said, a lot of old timers still carried those. So think about this for a second, though. This was before Microsoft Word, before the internet. I think about that sometimes now when we wrote reports and they still had the old carbon paper in the center of them. You remember those?
Oh, absolutely. They were a pain in the butt if you messed up, and they were hysterical if you played a practical joke on a peer.
Yeah, you smeared the carbon paper, and you had white out, and you'd have to white out through 2 or 3 different copies if you didn't do it wrong, And I was trying to think what technology was there. It was certainly nothing in the field really that I can even think of from a standpoint of, kind of maybe today's technology. And what's funny, and I heard a mutual friend of ours, Roy Bedard, say this one time, which is we're still using sticks. We were using sticks back then. You remember? And it was just an old straight stick or a PR-24, and pepper spray maybe. Pepper spray was new at the time, relatively new.
Yeah, so I started just a little bit before you in 1992, and we did get trained on the revolver, and then we did a crossover to the semi-automatic. And there was a lieutenant at the Tallahassee Police Department where you and I both worked named Bob Wetherington, and Bob was an avid shooter, as you know, and he wore a wheel gun. He had a .45 revolver, and he always had some new gadgets on his gun belt. And one day he had something new that was new to me. It was called a moon clip. And I'm like, hey, LT, what's that? And he's like, son, that's lunch. He's like, I can beat anybody anywhere with this old revolver and that moon clip. So, yeah. And then when I started, there was no technology. We had something called a monadnock, straight stick.
Oh, yeah.
A pistol, 2 magazines, flashlight, handcuffs, and that was it.
Sure. But, I was telling somebody, I'm trying to think when the cell phone kind of became, people certainly had bag phones, but we didn't have them, right? Nobody had them in the business. But I can remember getting issued a bag phone in like 94-ish, something like that in the field. And then right after that, it was a smaller than bag phone. It was it was a Nokia or a StarTech back in the day. I can't remember what it was called, but it was that cell phone.
Yeah.
What I thought was the height of cool was when I got a pager.
Yeah.
Right? If you had a beeper, you were, And I used to laugh every time that beeper went off. I was like, I'm getting paid.
Yeah.
Overtime is on. Overtime is on.
You were walking in high cotton when the pager went off, man.
Yeah, you were. But it's funny because I was thinking, and of course we're focusing particularly on technology and how it impacts our business. But really from a leadership standpoint, the same men and women, the same folks that were good leaders and supervisors back then, they would be the same people today. The same thread it takes to be a leader. And I didn't say a boss, a leader. I think it's still the same elements though, right? I mean, it's just the same thing.
It would be. And those would be the same people to embrace and deploy technology because their heart was leadership and their heart was, back then it was solving crimes. Yeah. That's what we did. And if there was a new element that could be deployed that would make solving crimes more efficient or effective, the good leaders would jump all over it.
Sure. I remember in 1997-ish, maybe, the first GPS unit I saw that they were using to track sexual offenders in the state of Florida. And this thing was half the size of a car battery, and you had to have it charged, and it was a separate unit piece on the leg. And I think Florida was one of the first in the nation to use it. And it was the delay on it, it's so primitive by today's standards. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think it might have been a system called Veritrax.
Yes, something like that. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I remember meeting with then FDLE Director Tim Moore, Commissioner Tim Moore, and then TPD Chief Walt McNeil at the time, and we did a demonstration of this, new technology, and literally it was half the size of a battery, right?
Yeah, I remember they talked about, so again, going back to Tallahassee, they started this serious habitual offender program for juveniles.
SHOCAP.
It was SHOCAP. And they used the Veritrax, but what we used to call it in roll call was Beartrax, just because it was slang and we didn't really know what it was, so they came in and explained it. And that's a big component of today's technology too, is we're visual learners. Most police officers are visual learners, and you have to come in and show us how it works, why it works, and the importance to us keeping us safe. But that was back then. That was state of the art, and now it's archaic. It'd be in a museum.
Yeah, and it's funny because even with the personal protection devices, like I remember the first electrical stun unit I saw, right? And if you remember the first, stun gun, because I don't think it was called taser then. I think it was actually, maybe it was, but it was a big. It looked like an old. It's not 9-volt, but the lantern flashlights you used to get.
Yeah.
It was huge. The thing was huge, I think everybody probably became familiar with it during the Rodney King incident back in when that was 92 maybe?
Yeah, 92.
92, something like that. And I think it was the first time that many people, it certainly was the first time I had ever seen one, right? But I can remember in the mid-90s they were using to transport inmates stun belts, where it would give a shock if you tried to resist but you're already in custody largely, right? The first time I remember seeing what is a taser, and that's kind of ubiquitous for the name of it, I'm going to guess it's at 2000 at TPD, and I remember them walking this thing. It was Chris Cannell, who was you and I both knew. Then was I think he was a sergeant at the time, maybe a lieutenant, and walking out with this taser, and say, look. You can't fight through this taser. And if you remember pepper spray a decade plus earlier, they used to say, well, you can't fight through it. It's liquid fire and nobody can fight through it. And of course, as cops, we found out later that people can walk through that stuff. There's people that can take a bath in it, right?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, and half the time it was us that ended up wearing it. I used to hate to see somebody pull it out because I'm like, oh my gosh, man, put that stuff away. We're going to be stuck with this stuff.
Yeah, you would almost cringe when you hear somebody holler out OC or pepper spray.
Yeah, because you knew you were going to get it. It got on you as much as it did the bad guy, right?
Yeah.
But I remember that taser, and I remember Chris saying, or Lieutenant Cannell at the time, I might have been Sergeant time. Anyway, just saying, look, you can't fight through this. And everybody in the room was like, yeah, right. That's what they said about pepper spray and all that. And I remember them, there was probably 20 some odd people in the room, and they were going to do a demonstration. And if there's one thing I've learned in 32 years in this business, you want to be first, because the anticipation of the pain, if it doesn't work, is more than you can bear.
Yeah.
I said, well, go ahead. Let me, as they would say in the country, I said, let me go and have me a little bit of that. Right. And I walked over and got one. Back then it was the big unit. If you remember, it was a really big taser. Put one on my shoulder and one down on my ankle. And 5 seconds later, I felt like the world had ended.
Yeah.
And I said, oh, this is something different here. This is not, and the other thing I remember about it is I tried to shake off what had just happened to me is the look on some of these folks' faces that didn't go first, so because now they've seen it. They've seen it 1, 2, 3. And the guy that went last, he was about to run out of the only pure pride in the fact somebody blocked the door kept him from leaving the door.
Yeah.
Because it was bad. It was bad. And I just couldn't believe it. And I remember thinking at the time, well, this is the evolution. We'll never have a fight again. This is the greatest thing ever. And of course, technology is a tool, right? And it's got certain applications, but you can't be over reliant. Right. And isn't that what a leader has to understand is look, it's not the right tool for every incident. It's not going to work every time.
Absolutely. You have to, because to your point about leadership, when we write a policy, I mean, there's always unintended consequences that can be good or bad.
Sure.
And you're right. So, yeah, you have to think outside the box and think about when is the best time and environment to use a taser, just like you talked about with OC. There's same. I had blown out my knee a few years earlier fighting with somebody with a straight stick and pepper spray. And when I got hit with the taser, it was back when I was on the SWAT team at Tallahassee Police, and there was the same Lieutenant Connell, God rest his soul, and he was delighted to see how we all responded to it. And I'm with you. I'm like, well, if nobody's going to fight through this. And now it's that taser is certainly obsolete, and now the tasers that are after these days even have cameras with them, and they even can activate your car cameras and other things when they're deployed. It's the technology is just amazing.
The other thing too is there's a phenomenon. It's called Maslow's hammer. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but basically it says this: if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And you give somebody a taser, and it's this brand new thing, and you are trying to use it for every application. And to that point, it just didn't work. I remember, I think it may have been the first application of taser in the field at Tallahassee Police Department at the time. And what I remember being in the Leon County Jail and this suspect coming in, this arrestee coming in, and he came in with a guy named Chuck Perry, who you and I both know. And
legendary.
Yeah, absolutely legendary. And what I remember is this guy that had just been arrested and just been tased, telling the story of being tased to everybody in booking and everybody in the holding cell, and he was quite colorful. He had a story to tell. And he shot me out of a tree, explicative, like a squirrel. And it was just one of those things I'll never forget. And you know what? It's so funny. I used to say, why do you tase officers too? But I instantly knew what he was talking about. As he described it, I went, yeah, that's what it felt like.
Yeah, it certainly makes the officer or the deputy understand the discretion and what it would feel like to abuse that, that piece of that device.
Yeah. I remember telling Lieutenant Connell at the time, I thought, well, you don't shoot me. Why am I got to get tased by this thing? That old argument. But I have to say, in retrospect, I understand it.
Yeah.
As a leader now, I kind of understand where that came from. You have some level of empathy and understanding of what's going on, Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely. And so look how things have changed. So when you and I started, there were no car computers, and we talked about the weapons were basic. I remember the night I got issued OC spray, it was amazing. And then when the tasers came out, and then at one point when I was a detective, we still typed our reports. And that's in my lifetime. And I look in the mirror and I see an old man, but in my mind, I don't think that. But back then we still typed arrest warrants.
And even the style, if you remember, you went to the academy, and you and I went, contemporaneously, which was you wrote in third person.
Yeah.
This officer, the defendant, was a triangle. Yeah. You referred to it. It was just structurally, it was so different. The radios were the size of, an impact weapon. And I can remember working with the state, and we used to joke that whatever policy came out, there was, should be named after the person who was responsible for it.
Right.
And, and so these radios were so big and they were really. Do you remember a thing called skip, John? Where the radio would skip?
Yes.
It would low level bounce off the atmosphere. So if it was right, you might hear somebody in Texas talking.
Yeah.
And way before encrypted radios, years later, I can remember coming to Walton County and was chief of police at the time, and they were telling me about people monitoring our radio communications. And I just couldn't understand that because Tallahassee Police Department was encrypted radio, right? They went to encrypted radio really pretty quickly.
Yeah, early adopters,
Yeah, early adopters of that. But that wasn't the case in this part of the state where I'm at now. And yeah, there were people that sit around and they monitored. Everybody had a scanner.
Yeah.
And so they monitored what you were doing, and people would call and say, I heard there was a call down at such and such house. And they would call to a family member and say, hey, the police are on their way to your house.
That was the early version of COPS, audio only. The scanners. Yeah.
You know what's funny is people were really angry when we encrypted radios.
Yeah, there's a big blowback.
The big blowback. And, people should hear this, transparency. But the truth is we were giving out people's medical information. They were calling people that maybe had been hurt or deceased, calling their family before we even got there. But for a lot of people, that was their entertainment. You talk about cops. For a lot of people, that was their entertainment. They would sit around at night and listen to scanners. Yeah. And it was such a foreign concept to me. I could not understand that,
Yeah, absolutely. It was. I didn't get that either. So I grew up in a public safety family, and the first scanner we got was my brother and I were, probably 11 or 12, and we had it when my dad was on duty at the fire station. Sometimes to try to see where he was getting dispatched, and then, we wanted to see the old man in action. So sometimes we would try to roll that way and catch him. So
yeah. It was funny because I just really remember it became apparent to me one time we were doing a stakeout on a methamphetamine house, a lab, basically a meth lab. And we realized that the subject had a scanner and was monitoring traffic of us setting up there. And it was a very scary situation, but I said, this has got to change. We've got to change this.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It's a life safety thing, right? Almost immediately. And, I'll stay with that life safety and technology. Look at the difference between vest in 1993 and the, body armor of today.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's 1,000 times lighter. It's moldable. It's easy to use. It's more impact resistant. Yeah, wearing a dark green or a dark blue uniform in the heat of summer under a couple layers of polyester was miserable.
Yeah, yeah. And there's always that balance of, you can get better armor, but you can't move.
Yeah. Remember the ballistic shields were so big they were on wheels.
Yeah, absolutely. Ballistic shields were so big they were on wheels. Yeah.
What crimes do you remember back then that at the time seemed sophisticated and now would seem almost amateurish? Do you remember?
Yeah, I think to me the two areas of crime that people were always ahead of the cops, and maybe you argue still are today, are your frauds, right? Your Ponzi scheme frauds, right? Everything from back then they just used the mail. Right, largely, or door to door, or do you remember the old travelers? You used to have a lot of those.
Oh yeah,
yeah. And so they would show up, and you couldn't verify their business license, and you couldn't, they were paving, take a little money, run to the next town, and you just could not get to them fast enough. That and obviously your drug dealers. Listen, they were using beepers way before we got in that business. They were using cellular before we got into that business, and I think that is a reality of them being innovative, Yeah,
and I actually think that's also another red thread that's going to run through our conversation today as we start getting into how technology progressed and where it's going. But right now, we've kind of reminisced about how things were when we got trained and hired, and we were both in an officer or an operator position. And then as you started to transition away from being a line level person and you started looking further down range about, going into leadership, do you remember what was some of the first technology that opened your eyes? And before you answer that, I neglected to say this. So Sheriff Adkinson started with probation and parole. He came over to the Tallahassee Police, was there for a good number of years, and then he went on to be the elected town marshal of the city of Defuniak Springs, which is one of the few towns in Florida that has an elected police chief or town marshal. And then from there, Sheriff Adkinson ran against the incumbent sheriff and won. And Sheriff, what term are you on now?
Fifth. I just selected my fifth term.
Which is amazing. So in Florida, the sheriff's terms are 4 years.
Right.
So, okay, it's fascinating.
I'm just sitting here thinking about it because, a couple of things that I thought were just mind-boggling at the time, honestly, was the advent of DNA really starting to pick up, right? So, I mean, obviously they had some DNA through the early 90s in some places, but as the DNA and the lab services of, then at the time, Department of Law Enforcement, I just thought, man, we're going to really, where is this DNA going? Where is this ability to some of the surveillance stuff at the time? I really thought was going to be the kind of the end all be all, right? I won't call it there's a term they call it the CSI effect.
Sure.
I don't know if you remember that, which everybody was watching CSI and they thought, well, every DNA test comes back in 48 hours and they, that wasn't my thought. It wasn't that, it's going to, tomorrow we're going to have our DNA test back. But I just kept thinking this is progressing so fast that there is going to be a time between this. That was the advent of cameras in cars too, really, for the most part. There were cameras before DUI units had them, but I could see in 2005, 06, these things are starting to get ubiquitous. They're starting to come along. You could see that this was happening. You could see that body cameras were coming along. And how does that change the interaction with the public, Those were things that I saw coming, but it was the computer that I think was when I realized in 07, maybe 06, 07, 08, the ability to commit crime at scale was something I just was not. I understood that it was, an issue, but I don't think I understood the opportunity that went with that.
Oh yeah, how could you? How could any of us? So that's about the time frame that you had successfully gotten elected as the town marshal under Funiac. So there's a whole nother podcast that we could talk about how to make the jump from being where you were, in a uniform as a call handler to being a supervisor overnight and being an agency head. But as an agency head and as somebody that was trying to predict growth and change not only in your community but in policing, how did you do that? I mean, did you foresee yourself as a forecaster back then or a futurist, or was it just something you were interested in how technology was developing?
So, it's funny because I think what I was willing to do, I think what I've always been willing to do to an extent is I'm not afraid to fail. I saw them just that. I saw this technology as opportunities to engage and to be, because some people weren't, as well as I do, if you can thinking back then, some people didn't want any part of a computer in a car. They didn't see any application for GPS. We were looking at geofencing and hotspots, talking about maybe using different words in 05, 06, 07, but it was certainly starting to come back. And I'm going to take you back. If you're going to remember an investigator, Cecil Toll. I can remember back, Cecil was a homicide guy at Tallahassee Police Department. But I actually remember in 1991, I was at Tallahassee Police Department doing an internship and watching him have what I would call the early version of a manual computer where he had all these suspect characteristics, right? And he had punch holes and he would, if certain characteristics that he was looking for, he had it grouped in such a way that those would come up first, but they were index cards. And I thought about in 2004, 2005, when we first started seeing these first real hotspot policing. A lot of these names have changed, right? You and I came along in the era, something called CompStat, if you remember.
Yep.
Back in the 90s. And that was a tremendous success for the city of New York. And what happened was that everybody wanted to do a version of it. But what they also did was stray away from the original concepts. And I was guilty of some of that too. So I think because of my age at the time, I was willing to try and engage this stuff because we were seeing success with what a lot of people were doing individually as officers, detectives, first line folks going, hey, I can make a better case if I look where, all these crimes had happened. And there's this new technology, whatever, that a lot of the CAD or computer-aided dispatch and record management systems started giving you the ability to bunch together offenses and to generate reports. And so I kind of saw the technology as an opportunity to be a kind of a front runner.
No, and that's fascinating. Number one, that you brought up Cecil. So, having grown up in Tallahassee, Cecil Toll was a legend, and he's an icon. God bless him. He's if you don't know this, Cecil was also a Vietnam Marine. He was in the Marine Corps in Vietnam, and he was the walk and talk and deal. And so here's somebody that was a leader that was breaking out of the mold, and he was doing the same thing Jack Maple did back in the subways of New York. You mentioned Compstat, and Jack Maple was one of the early adapters or adopters of that, or actually kind of formulated that because they were having so many muggings on the subway system back then. And Cecil was doing his own version, and he used that successfully. And the fact that you brought that up, and based on your earlier comments, there's also somebody that you and I work with named Rudy Henson, and Rudy was a sergeant that we worked for and was also, ironically, a Marine in Vietnam. But Rudy was the first person that ever brought up Compstat to me, and that was something that we started using on night shift in Frenchtown in the early 1990s, and he was often mocked about that.
Sure.
Until Police Chief McNeil became the police chief, and then we adopted what you just said was a version of Compstat, and back then it was called STAC. It was Statistics, Tactics, and Crime Control.
Yeah.
And so that's fascinating that you said that. And both of those gentlemen were leaders, and they deployed that technology before it was even really popular to do so.
John, add to that just a minute, because you said something I think that is crucial. When you talk about both Sergeant Rudy Henson and Investigator Cecil Toll, the other part of that, the term you used, they were mocked for it, right?
Yeah.
And those guys were not young in their career at the time they started that. Again, they had come back from Vietnam in the 70s and 80s, but they were, to show their leadership skills, they were 20 years into the job, 20 plus years in the job when they were doing that, starting that. In other words, they were taking and learning something new and applying it with the experience they had to use that new technology.
Yeah.
Right? But they were not afraid of being mocked. So I think that, a little bit of willingness not to be afraid to fail, to engage it, is important. The other thing is not to be, and sellout's the wrong word, but I've seen people over the course of my 32 years at this now, and I know you have as well, that every new bright shiny penny is going to solve everything and be the greatest thing in the history of policing. And they go so all in that they lose credibility, right? So we stay on this project for a while, and this is the greatest thing ever, and then I'm gonna switch to this, and this is the greatest thing ever, and this is and then nobody wants to listen. Where people like, go back to Rudy and Cecil Toll and those investigators, and I'm sure many cops across the country like this, that implemented it slowly, adding to their experience with it at the same. So they're not afraid to try something new, but they didn't buy the farm the first time out. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's an important thing.
Yeah, because honestly, that can lead to mission creep. It can lead to technology or change fatigue. So that's a very important thing to bring out.
Yeah, and those guys with their experience, they recognized there was something to this.
Yeah,
and maybe this is not quite technology, but I'm gonna give you an example of something I think is very much in that vein, because officer wellness, mental health awareness, emotional stability of our staff now is to the forefront. Well, as well as I do, that was not the case. That was never the case in this business, previous to maybe even 5 or 6 years ago. People didn't really talk about this stuff,
right?
The impact on staff. But I actually remember in 2009, I remember making it mandatory for everyone to attend what at the time was fairly new. It was called Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement by Dr. Kevin Gilmartin.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I had people lose their mind when I said we were going to go to this. The hippie sheriff, that's what it was. The hippie sheriff is going to make us go to emotions. We don't have emotions. I said, well, you may not have emotions, but you're going to have you behind there, or you're going to go to work somewhere else.
Yeah.
So the mistake we also make is we say, well, you can't help somebody that don't want help, or you can't make them. That's not true. You hold their head to the water long enough, he'll take a drink.
Yeah.
That's just the reality. And sometimes it takes that. But the reason I brought that up is because at the time, my undersheriff, so this is 2009, and he had 35 years on the job then. And he did not want to go to that class for anything in the world. And I said, Bill, you're the undersheriff. You're going to go. You got to do it. You got to lead the way. When he came out, he stopped me in the parking lot and said, Sheriff, I'm going to tell you something. I wish I had this when I was younger. I would have a relationship with my son now. a better relationship with my son and my children. And I thought, that is the absolute proof of the pudding, right? But you've got to be willing to be called the hippie sheriff to do it. You got to be willing to try. And so when we see these new technologies, right now we're the kind of the same way everybody was into Comstat and then GPS in the vehicles and then, certainly the computers in the car, the ability to dispatch in the car was a major, major factor, right?
Yeah.
But, and the technology changes and things like, tasers and even the flashlights are brighter now. Nobody carries a 5-cell D-cell kill light anymore, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a relic. It's in a museum.
It's in a museum somewhere.
Yeah.
I still have an old slapjack. There was an issue here.
Yeah.
Issue. I was very, listen.
It was issued there in your lifetime.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. So, you got to understand that some of these things have changed and they've become antiquated. But there's a lot of technology that popped up along the way that everybody jumped all in on that they're not there, technique or whatever that's not there. Maybe it wasn't even that it wasn't good, but it just wasn't implemented the right way and that caused it to fail, Yeah. So do you remember back in the day, the old PR-24s?
Oh, yeah. TJ Hooker.
Yeah, TJ Hooker, man. You could I was lived to throw that thing. It's just I wanted to throw and take somebody down with like TJ Hooker. But, I just say that to say this. Right now as we look at drones and what the applications of what drones do. I sold this agency, had 3 helicopters for a number of years. I looked at 25 years of usage of those helicopters. So why do we have helicopters? Well, we got they're cool. Don't get me wrong. People love them. But when you ask people, they said, well, if we need to jump out somewhere, we're doing this stuff, we're looking for people. Well, look, in 30 years, nobody ever jumped out of that helicopter. That's what we call a clue. So if you're keeping them so you can jump out of them, if you need to deploy somewhere, well, that's not happening. You're not doing that to start with. And then so you have to be willing to let some of that go and say, you know what, listen, a drone is doing everything we need it to do in search and rescue and manpower hunts that a helicopter can't. Because we really never, we never use them to deploy staff. We just didn't.
And we'll be right back. Every day you put your life on the line to protect and serve. Who's protecting you? United Badges Insurance Services operates as a dedicated resource for the first responder public safety community. Serving thousands of first responders, United Badges offers a wide range of products including commercial insurance, group accident and health insurance, and personal insurance such as auto, home, renters, rental properties, vacation properties, boat, motorcycle, RVs, flood, and umbrella. United Badges serves active and retired public safety personnel, public safety agencies, public safety associations, public safety support businesses, and public safety families and friends. Experience the United Badges difference. Call 800-566-5990 or visit unitedbadges.com to request your free insurance quote today. United Badges Insurance Services is a proud strategic partner of the Florida Deputy Sheriff's Association. Applicants are individually underwritten by each respective insurance carrier and subject to insurance policy terms and conditions. Not available in all states. Promotional material for descriptive purposes only. Now back to the show.
Yeah, and then the cost disparity. It used to be, it was before COVID, it was about $600 an hour for that helicopter just to fire up the engine and hover for 1 foot off the ground. And the cost of drones now are so affordable. So
sure,
and it takes leadership at the top for you to see that and walk away and go, no, there's something more efficient.
Yeah, people were really mad when we got rid of the helicopters because that was, a sense of pride too. And I'm not saying that everything needs to be stripped down and there's not a sense of loyalty and pride to the organization and cool stuff that we do. Yeah, that's true. But I feel that way about, I always used to say, if you bought a patrol car and you didn't have a cage in it, what are we doing? Right? Or if you bought I used to say about agencies that didn't make people wear vests.
Yeah.
That's a lack of leadership. Now, with all due respect, and I'm trying to hurt somebody's feelings, but I can show you a wall full of dead cops that should have been wearing vests.
Yeah.
But somebody didn't want to be mean and tell them they had to. And I always say I manage like mama. Mama don't care if you like it.
That's right.
I care if you're safe and you're successful. The fact it hurts your feelings or it's uncomfortable, listen, go somewhere else.
Yeah.
That's the way your mama raised you, right? That's the way you think, and again, I'm somewhat facetious, but it's the same thing with this technology. Every time we bring something new in, there's two adopters, right? There's the early adopter and there's the lagger. We have to be somewhere in the middle. The early adopter can't be, we can't sell the farm and say, we're going to use robots, nothing but robot patrols now or drone patrol. Well, maybe, but we're not there yet. And so let's ease into it. Let's don't sell. Everybody wanted to go to, not everybody, but a lot of people want to go to Priuses a number of years ago, right? Save some. And in fact, I remember a commercial at the time when the Prius first came out. There was, I think it was painted up like a California Highway Patrol car. And it's in this little pursuit, and all that good stuff. Well, that's great, but you're only getting 200 miles to a charge in a fully electric car at the time. And you don't have room for all the gear that you're asking me to carry. So some of this stuff is just a balance.
Yeah, well, and not only that, but when the hybrid cars came out, they weren't geared for all the electrical things that a police car needs with the light bar and computers and stuff.
Sure, absolutely. Even the things that people traditionally think of cops doing. I'll give you an example: unlocking a car door. Well, that was great until we got side airbags. Side airbags kind of made that really difficult to use traditional Slim Jim.
Right.
Those kind of things, because you do so much damage to the electronics in the vehicle.
Yeah, all in the name of doing a good deed for somebody, and then and
they'd sue you. You get sued for you. Had a problem with it, so you can't jump off. You mentioned the electronics in a car. You can't jump off somebody's vehicle with today's modern patrol vehicle.
No,
you've got so much electronics in it. You run the risk of frying something.
And I'm sure most of our listeners are probably first responders or spouses or friends, and they might know that. But other people are clueless about that. It's, working a special event for you with spring break coming up or, in a town like Daytona Beach with the Speedway or, Florida State and Tallahassee. People come to town to visit, and they expect, especially from their local elected sheriff, that you'll have a huge customer service mindset and you'll be willing to do those things. But they forget about technology in some ways has taken away some of the customer service that we can offer.
Yeah, it really has. It really has. And the other thing is, the body camera is ubiquitous and everybody wants the body camera until they're on it.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so when we pass laws and make policies, a lot of people never foresee it applying to them.
That's a great point. So two things you brought up. One is we've been circling it, but we talked about early adopters, and we talked about like you personally I know personally because you're my friend outside of work. I know you're fascinated with technology and emerging technology, which is why you're the first guest that we've had on to discuss this. But do you see a trend in law enforcement agencies about hiring a forecaster, a futurist, and kind of based on that book that we discussed by Mark Goodman about future crimes? Do you see that is a relevant thing that most agencies are going to need as they continue to move into this century?
I think 100% somebody should be looking eyes downrange. And let me, you mentioned Mark Goodman, and you and I have talked about future crimes, his book is, and then there was a book and a lecture, a TED Talk from about 2007, I think, 2006, 2007 he gave. It was called Visions of Crime in the Future. And I encourage people to go back and watch that. They have not seen that. It's Mark Goodman. But he was talking about, if you remember, the talk was in Glasgow, Scotland, and he talked about printing weapons. I can tell you that this organization has seized 2 printed 9mm or 2, 9mm pistols in the last 2 to 3 months. Listen, I couldn't imagine that in 2006 for sure.
Yeah.
That you could print a weapon off or a sear, a seat for an upper to turn a AR full auto.
Yeah, it's crazy. And even that movie with Clint Eastwood about In the Line of Fire, you remember there was a plastic weapon that was made in somebody's home. And then when it was on the movie, it was state of the art. And he'd already talked about that in the book and that it's prevalent in today. And we see that.
It's interesting because it fundamentally makes the change can invalidate some gun laws.
Yeah.
Think about that for a second. If you're printing these things out, what do? Do you lock down the information to allow people to print? I mean, it's a lot of things to consider. And we were talking about future looking downrange. I'll tell you something that just recently changed in Florida. But there was, there used to not be a prohibition against the depiction of child pornography if they were not real.
Yep. Basically,
right? If you remember that. That's recently changed in Florida, but I'm stunned at what can be done with AI and voice morphing. Mm-hmm. And it is so fundamentally changed. Somebody could take this interview with you and I and put the most outrageous things you've ever heard in our mouth and do it well.
And probably sound more grammatically correct than you or I.
Yeah,
You know?
for sure, right? They'll probably sound better. But then also think about the bias toward hearing it. So pick your political party. It doesn't matter to me. I could care less. But pick your political party. If all of a sudden you see a video and it's whatever, you say it's Nancy Pelosi talking about how she secretly wants to run the world, right? She's drunk. You're inclined to believe that. You're inclined to believe that. And then if you see one of Donald Trump and he says, I want 5 terms and I'm going to make a fascist state, and you're inclined to believe that, you got a problem. We got a problem, right? So, that and things like what I'll call the large veil of cyber stalking. I mean, these things are seriously problematic.
Well, to your point, think about this. So we used to, when I was a kid, we played the telephone game. Then at one point when I was fortunate enough to be promoted, to an administrator in the sheriff's office I worked at, there was an underlying game that happened about who wanted to call me or the sheriff and be the first provider of information. And it was a very serious game that was played, but 99 times out of 100, the information was wrong. So to your point here with this AI, if somebody makes something, some sabotage material and puts it out there, I mean, our brain's kind of trained to go, hey, that's first, that must be accurate. And we don't listen for the follow-up stories for somebody to go, no, that was fake. That's incorrect. That was sadistic. That's not true. We don't wait for that story, nor does the news report it. So, I mean, you're right. That's a very valid point, and it's damaging.
And the problem is, I saw one the other day with somebody who I actually follow and listen to, right? And something about it didn't sound just quite right. It was certainly his voice, and it wasn't anything outrageous. But what had happened is it had been altered in the style that he would speak in. And the person that altered it was trying to make a point that he believed this speaker would make. So he wasn't trying to intentionally hurt him. He was trying to use that speaker's credibility to support his position.
Yeah.
I just happened to catch it, and a couple other people saw it. I'm like, wow. That's really incredible.
So right here in this discussion, you're sitting up a little bit more. I'm sitting up a little bit more because it's scary and exciting in the same way, right?
Sure.
Because it's just in our conversation, this is getting ready to just explode. So a couple of things is it's terrifying, and it's going to alter not just the regular world. It's not just going to alter our state or your county or my community. It's going to alter how we police and how we live. And some of that goes with just what you're talking about. When a robocaller calls your phone and you say hello 3 times and they hang up on you. Yeah. They are, in a way, they're just trying to get your voice to verify what you might sound like, to then go make an AI voice and perhaps do something sinister. And then the other thing is, from an evidence perspective, I spent a good amount of time in investigations, and I know you have too, is now we have to be concerned about deep fake videos. And also when it comes to a deputy's body-worn camera, how do we ensure to the public or to the judicial system that the camera footage that was captured is protected and was not altered and then submitted into evidence and kept in an evidence, quote, virtual vault without being contaminated? I mean, all those things, there's a reason we're talking about, because somebody's compromising some of that material as we speak.
Yeah, so I have to tell you, we actually dealt with a case here, which started out as an employee internal complaint with an allegation made. And what had happened at the time was that the employee that made the complaint did not realize there was video in the room in which she had made this complaint. And the video instantly showed that her story was not credible. However, she launched a campaign to say that the video had been altered. And what it took for us to prove that it wasn't altered was pretty phenomenal. And by the way, that was with old technology.
Yeah.
That was with old technology. So I'm very concerned about what can be done now. And by the way, think about this from public perception standpoint. He who gets off first wins in the public.
Yeah.
So if I put out a video of, John and Mike beating somebody with a stick, or planning something, or pushing them. Let's don't say it's that dramatic, but you say that I planted something or pushing something, pushing somebody. You're never not going to believe that wasn't the first one, wasn't the true one, right? Because if you're explaining, you're losing. If I'm trying to explain, I'm losing. You see that a lot now with people putting first blush of videos without context or anything else, but that's even before we start altering. So this altering and the deep fake ability is pretty staggering. I saw one this last week that was interesting as the new administration has come in, and again, this is not a political statement at all, but I found it very interesting. It was about that DOE's, Department of Governmental Efficiency, right? And they were talking about all the money they had found that was saved. And one of the things they said was they'd found $84 million that was given to Chelsea Clinton and used $4 million for a wedding. Well, listen, first of all, that's factually not true. And somebody had put it out originally as kind of a parody. These are the kind of things they're going to find. I saw 3 iterations of that later where people were passing it around because it completed their narrative. This has nothing to do with like the Clintons or the Trumps. It doesn't matter. The point was, by the time the third or first part, they were repeating it as gospel. This is 100% true. They have found X.
Yeah.
It plays that narrative. And once I've heard it 10 times and I try and explain that's not true, wow. People just don't want to believe that.
Well, especially you as an elected official who based your career on being transparent, and now You're standing there trying to explain something that the rest of the general population is like, the sheriff's being shady here.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, the other thing is the desire to be first and fastest.
Yeah.
Right. So cell phone video cameras everywhere. Let's just say it's a homicide and we're investigating it. You're putting out everything you see with absent of context. You're putting out, well, why aren't you not telling us this? I saw this and they did X, Y, Z. We recently had a standoff with a gunman, and we had people who have a very biased view of things putting out information, and some of it was limited information. They weren't even being biased; they were just limited, and they're in real time putting it out. Well, the suspect was watching this. The suspect could read and see what you're saying. And people do not think of that. It's unbelievable to me that lack of, and the second we weren't giving them information, then you're being non-transparent. You are hiding something. Well, we're in the middle of the operation, right? And there's a tactical reason for some of this. And then after the fact, why did you wait so long to tell us? We didn't wait. Within 5 minutes of it ending, you were told. But so it's just that perception.
Yeah, the landscape's changing. I mean, that was one of the scenes in that movie Speed. Remember with Keanu Reeves was about the SWAT team operations being broadcast live, for the suspect.
Yeah.
So we're still dealing with that.
Sure.
Let me go back to 2 things. One is you talked about the new legislation that came out. So there was a case down in Martin County, and I learned about this from a colleague of yours and mine named Major George Pereira, who is with the Miami-Dade Sheriff's Office. And George has a very vital position there. He's basically oversees anything they investigate that has to do with cyber crimes, AI, emerging technologies, and he's a leading subject matter expert on the field. But in a presentation George shared with you and I, he had a video from a Martin County Sheriff's Office arrest where a man had gone to a local playground. He lived, I believe, in a gated community, and the playground was open for any child to come play. And he was taking video of children playing and then came home and used an app or a download that he'd gotten, I think it was off the dark web, but I think it was easily obtainable. And what he did was he took the images of the children's face from the playground and morphed them onto the previous child pornography and then re-released it as new material. So in that realm, if whoever has new material can get very, very wealthy very quick. And at the time, there was a debate about what crime did he commit, who's the victim, and what jurisdiction and what agency is going to investigate that. So what you just talked about from our legislature here in Florida, can you just tell the listeners a little bit more about that, how that is going to alleviate some of the concerns? Yeah,
so I think, Florida, very wild, and quite frankly, this slipped under the radar. I didn't actually even catch this until after the fact. But Florida said, the manufacture, creation of simulation child pornography and or the aging forward of that is a crime under Florida law. And I think it was critically important, but I think all of us, and I saw George's presentation as well, and that was a great offering by the Florida Deputy Sheriff's Association. But, what we don't realize is we put our children's faces out on the internet, and they take your daughter or your wife's face or your face and put on, a pornographic actress in the middle of that. And by the way, who's ever, people love to believe salacious stuff. So if you take somebody, I've got a secret recording of X, and you make it just a little clip, and you put out, people will always believe that your significant other was involved in this, right? Or a voiceover or those kind of things. So, and previously it wasn't a crime.
Yeah.
Now it is, and it needs to be.
It certainly does.
But even with a crime, the damage done with putting somebody's face on a false, I'm going to use pornography because that's the easiest one, of somebody who somebody else might have an interest of seeing. Even if you do it, there will always be a fraction of believes, oh yeah, that's really her. They're covering it up. Everything is now covered. Here's something for your listeners, and I always say this is Mike's Rule 101. Just because you don't know something doesn't mean it was a secret. 2, just because you don't like something doesn't mean it was illegal, right? And one of the things is there is so much data out there, information out there. Raw information coming at you in large volume is not communication. It's noise. And that's a real problem.
Yeah, I see that. That's a great point.
It's a real problem. It's a real problem. And by the way, it may take you years to find out that somebody did these things. You know, if it's not somebody that has a personal axe to grind with you, you know, what if you don't see it for 5 years later?
Yeah.
10 years later? Good luck tracking that down.
Right.
You know, and to your point about digitally altering evidence, I got a real concern about that now. I mean, it's a real, you know, somebody embeds it in something they send to you. I have real concerns about what this looks like in the future.
Well, let me ask you this, changing gears, but staying on the same racetrack. What about the emerging technology gives you hope? Not only hope in making a community safer, but, you know, hope and maybe as a law enforcement tool to keep a deputy safe or something.
So, you know, man, it's kind of interesting because it's the same thing that scares me, right? Yeah. Which is, you know, the ability of AI to monitor officer safety. Because I think we're going to be at a point in the next 5 to 10 years where we're live streaming officers when they're on the street back into a dispatch center. I care very much about that because if one of my deputies is not responding or we don't see it, if we could real time monitor, not necessarily even with the dispatch, but for instance, AI saying there's a struggle, there is X, there is these hand movements, whatever it is, it's going to have the ability to analyze everything we see on that video, right? Even if we missed it to start with and maybe give a warning. 2, to let us know instantaneously if there's a change to the arrhythmia of the heart, right? There's a lot of information going to be coming out in the next few years that I think it would be too much data for you and I to analyze. It's too much for a dispatcher to look at. It's too much, you know, running reports every week. But now this technology would allow you to monitor, for instance, you and I have talked about some bracelets that people wear, and people see what's the ring they wear, like a life bracelet or a polar heart monitor, some version of that. I can't imagine that I could foresee a time that a deputy sheriff or a police officer is wearing one of those, and if your heart rate got over a certain rate, they would be concerned. You know, even if you're sitting around, doesn't have to be engaged in something, but this thing could monitor your health while you're working.
Yeah, much
early warning.
Yeah, much like you and I use away from work when we're engaged in exercise and things like that. The technology is fascinating. What's coming, and you're right. At the same time, the double-edged sword of fascinating and terrifying. And I think it's all a matter of how we harness that technology and how we move forward with it. And I think all of us can agree that public safety, or quote, the government, is always leap years behind the private sector when it comes to technology, its implementation, and it's also its restrictions or creating a balance. And I think that's going to be one of the biggest things that we struggle with as a society as we move forward, is the balance between safety and private security. I think as we move forward too, Sheriff, that at some point we probably need to come back and have a follow-up podcast about what's going to happen next year, because there's going to be more technology that comes around the corner. And the second you implement it at your sheriff's office, it's almost obsolete.
Well, that's a truism of governmental purchasing, right? I mean, you know this as well as anyone, which is that, you do a year of it, you've heard about it, then you do a year of assessment, and then a year and a half of procurement, and a year of implementation, and 6 months to train. Well, that's about 3.5, 4 years, right? The rate of obsolescence, Moore's Law, is what, about every 18 months now?
Yeah, and getting faster and faster.
And getting faster. So, that's a real, you're essentially evaluating for new ideas the second you've already implemented the first one.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Sheriff, as we start to land the plane, there's a lot of things that we didn't even scratch the surface on. Real-time crime centers, tactical dispatchers, AI that's being embedded in body-worn cameras, or body-worn cameras that have resources to start writing a basic narrative in a police or a deputy sheriff's offense report. So I think at some point it would be good for you and I to come back. I mean, I think that your interest, not only as a colleague, but your interest as a sheriff and one of the larger agencies in Florida is fascinating. And we need to come back and have some follow-up discussion.
John, can I give you a prediction?
Yeah, let's hear it.
You're within a handful of years of automated drone patrols powered by AI. Let me tell you how that's going to work. US 331 runs from the Alabama line to the Gulf of America. And what you're going to see is that at some point, the monitoring of things like traffic flow problems, that'll be the first thing. Traffic flow problems, I could put a drone on a routine back and forth up and down US 331 to help us monitor traffic and be aware instantaneously of traffic crashes or backups. That starts one. Here's my other prediction, and I've pushed this for years as a future. Let's say you have a hurricane in the Keys, and everybody has to evacuate the Keys, right? And there's damage. Everybody wants to know what's going on with their home, but we can't let you back in immediately because there's damage. Imagine a world that I go to a laptop and I sign into the Monroe County Sheriff's Office, my residence at 123 Easy Street, and you send a drone to fly over 123 Easy Street and do a video examination of your home, and real time, you know that your home is standing or what the damage is before you get there. That is coming. That's a place where the law has not kept up, regulation has not kept up with the technology. It's moving so fast. We can't use drones like that now. Now, I am a huge private privacy and public advocacy for your privacy. But understand, we're talking about public spaces or something you request, right? So these kind of roadway things will be the first thing you see because you'll never have enough deputies to make everyone happy, right?
Yeah.
And so we see that with cameras like flock cameras with automated license plate readers now. Everybody hates them until they get them. I was not a fan of them. I cannot make the argument against them. They work in a public space. So I don't want to live under 24-hour surveillance. I don't think anyone does. But what I would say is that your real place I'm concerned about your privacy is in your home and in private places. But on roadways and things like that where we can make a difference and save lives, wow. Everybody's worried about terrorism, right? Everybody talks about terrorism. I think in every terrorist incident in the world and every combat death combined since 1992 in the United States is below 40,000, right at 40,000. I think there were 42,000 deaths in traffic accidents last year. That's 1 year, and then year over year. So sometimes it's about risk mitigation, not about exploiting public's fear, the fear of the public, right? Sure. What is going to do the most good for the most amount of people. But I just think that kind of technology is going to give you real opportunities. And hey, look, I don't want to be too iRobot, but think about this for a second. At some point, the way people operate the rate at which AI is increasing or the way robotics are increasing, is it possible that one day you have, for high-risk tactical situations, that you have a humanoid-style robot under the direct control of a deputy sheriff or a police officer go into a high-risk situation where they pose no chance of losing a life? Yeah, I think that's where you'll see it first. I mean, we currently use those robots now that look like something from Lost in Space in the 60s. But think about as AI gets better, one that is attuned to say, you will not harm a human life. And they go into a house with a barricaded subject that doesn't have a hostage there. We're at no risk to the public out there. That I think you're going to see. I think that's coming way, way sooner than later.
Well, I think you're right. And I think it's something that's been predicted, back to you and I, our childhood with Star Trek and even, the $6 Million Man when he fought the robot in the middle of the wilderness out in California. There's something very similar, Yeah,
that was Bigfoot, buddy.
Yeah, Bigfoot. And there was also like the death machine that he fought off.
Oh, yeah. Y'all forgot that one.
Well, Sheriff, as we wind down today's episode, I'm more than grateful for your time, your insight, and your intellect and your willingness to be frank and discuss, how things have changed, how things are, and what's coming down the pike. And I'd also like to invite our listeners to tune into you. You have a podcast and a weekly, it's weekly, right, program?
Well, so the podcast comes out a little more quarterly, and what we try and do is find subjects that are of interest. It's called The Art of Policing. The Art of Policing, and it's on Spotify, Apple, and all your major platforms. And what we try to do is really talk about issues that the public has an interest in. We've done immigration, Florida's concealed carry or open constitutional carry versus open carry, what that looks like, those types of things. And then we do things that are a little more routine, like what is the difference between a trespass warning and a restraining order. Right? People use those terms interchangeably. So we try to make it a public service, something that you can get some value add out of. And we invite if you can certainly email us here at the Walton County Sheriff's Office, or reach out to us. But take a look at that on Apple or Spotify, whatever platform. And if you have something you want us to do, we may do this, John. We may try and get you back on, and let's do it, the podcast, The Art of Policing, and talk about again what's coming in the future.
Oh, I would jump at the opportunity to do that. So,
yeah, awesome.
Again, Sheriff, thank you for your time. And listeners, we thank you for joining us today for a tactical pause. If you'd like to learn more about what the Florida Deputy Sheriff's Association does for its members and for our communities here in Florida, please visit us at fldeputisheriffs.org. There's a place for Q&A. There's a place to see the training opportunities that might be near you or your loved ones that are open for law enforcement. And we'd love to hear your feedback. So again, Sheriff Adkinson, thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for listening to The Tactical Pause, the official podcast of the Florida Deputy Sheriffs Association. FDSA proudly serves over 25,000 deputy sheriffs across the state with legal benefits, vital training, and financial assistance in times of need. You can listen to previous episodes at fldeputisheriffs.org or wherever you get your podcasts. If you've enjoyed the show, please leave us a review and encourage your friends, coworkers, and those in the law enforcement community to listen as well. To learn more about the Florida Deputy Sheriffs Association and how we serve those who serve, visit our website at fldeputisheriffs.org.